Yes, I mean we can only postulate how that might work out. Ultimately, what I would like to see is, more improved forms of communication. So if we look at the way that society is structured and the way that we have various trusted service providers, whether it's banks or healthcare or firefighters or law enforcement or whatever, the question you have to ask yourself is, can those service providers and the interactions that you have with them, can those be managed and performed in a way that does not require a trusted third party or an authority like a government actually managing the economic flow of how those providers are getting paid? In many cases, this makes sense that we have governments that are managing it right now because it's efficient. It's a lot easier just for the citizens to have to give money to one provider and then that provider figures out how to pay for various socialized services. So how do you replace that? Well, I think a lot of software has to be built. You would essentially have to have these autonomous agents, aka software, running that act on your behalf to manage your relationships with all of these other providers. So right now, it's not really feasible for you to have to directly interact with the people who are building your roads and laying fiber for internet and doing all of these other public infrastructure type things. So if you're going to get rid of the central party, then you need to have some software that is replacing it and making it, reducing the friction and the time and energy that would be required for you to manage a ton of relationships. I think a lot of it comes down to Dunbar's number. There's a limited number of other entities that you can keep track of in your brain and interact with on a regular basis. So, if there's more than 100 different companies and other contractors and entities that you're indirectly interacting with on a day-to-day basis, and those interactions are currently being managed by governments or other authorities, then we just need to figure out a way to have software, some new layer of software that's managing that instead on your behalf. And might require some artificial intelligence and machine learning and additional advances in computer science, but I think that it's ultimately a coordination problem and that I'm optimistic we can solve it with software. Yes, I mean, if you're going to have anarcho-capitalistic type of society, it's easy to envision the marketplace. Where it breaks down is that if you're asking each person to go out and spend time, searching the marketplace and vetting and figuring out reputation and other and payment issues, that's why it doesn't scale right now for an individual to live in that type of society. But I think software can automate quite a bit.
I think it would look a lot better. I think there is a need for a separation of state and money. So we've had the separation of church and state, but for some reason the state still manages money, and I think that's a bad thing. You're too prone to corruption, too prone to thinking on a short time horizon, and people in general are not really good at managing things. We think we are, but we're really not. So having a money like Bitcoin that's immutable and consensus driven, not majority driven, but consensus driven, opt-in participation, and you can opt out if you choose to, that's a better model, mathematically defined and reliable, and not prone to weaknesses of the human spirit. It's a matter of time. It's really just what people want, right? And people can opt out of the current system. They can opt out of the fiat currency system and opt into Bitcoin. And if enough people do that, then you kind of have that hyper-Bitcoinization play kicking in, which is you don't need to switch out fiat anymore. You can just stay in Bitcoin and pay in Bitcoin. I think, We'll get there. It's just a matter of when. I don't want to predict when. Maybe it's going to be 10 years, 20 years, but I really think it's just a matter of time because it's really just the general population realizing the utility, realizing the benefit, and understanding that the current system is broken, right? We have negative interest rates, we have massive amounts of debt piling up, and it's just spiraling out of control.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's what we came here for with Bitcoin, right? What happens when central banks aren't in control over the economy. I think we see a really beautiful system to where no one should have control over the money. No one man, woman, or a committee should have all that power. It's also an information problem. I think we'd see a system that's much more efficient with capital allocation. So there'd be a lot less taxes. There'd be a lot less services that are provided by the government that are inefficient. We'd see a lot less wars because wars are expensive. And people vote with their pocketbook, and I don't think people are going to willingly give up their Bitcoin to fight a war that they find kind of silly. I think we're going to see a much better capital allocation in terms of the economy itself. Prices reflect information, and Bitcoin as a conduit, as a money, reflects the information of the market. Bitcoin is largely perceived as a risk-off trade or a safe haven asset. And so if the whole world projects their emotions into Bitcoin, like if they're uncertain or fearful or doubtful about the economic future, they're going to buy more Bitcoin as a safety mechanism. And then they'll sell it when they feel more relaxed to sell it and then put that into other asset classes like equity or real estate. So I think that fundamentally changes how we price risk. Because now risk will be priced really well since everyone's aggregate feeling over the economy is now priced into Bitcoin. And from there, that being the risk-free rate, we can then build out risk models much more effectively. So that means that we allocate capital super efficiently, much better than what we had before, where a centralized entity comes out with a risk-free rate, which is actually not a true risk-free rate.
This is a question what is very hard to answer. So I think changing the existing, the situation can take a lot of time, and it doesn't happen immediately. In some countries, it can take a lot of time. So I'm not the political guy. I'm not the forecaster who can predict and say how it will happen. They're talking more about the blockchain like a tool. It can solve some of the problem in a more efficient way. Optimizing the cost, providing the additional benefits, providing better security, better speed, better flexibility, but it doesn't mean everything will be replaced immediately. It will take time. All the innovations, all tools are slowly will be replaced by a new, more efficient tool.
Well, what it looked like back before they controlled money. This was.
We don't remember.
Well, it's the historical norm, and even in the U.S., it was pre-1913, something like that. That it was. If you look at the 19th century, it was a time of enormous prosperity, limited government, lots of people going out to the frontier, making something of themselves. So a civilization of entrepreneurship, lots of personal responsibility, and growth, really.
Yeah, I think that there's two aspects of it. First of all, we have examples of states where the government does not control the money. And so in South America and in other countries, they've had situations where they dollarized and essentially used the US dollar as their money. Now, in Europe, they all, in the Eurozone, gave up their monetary sovereignty to give it to the ECB. And so we're seeing some of the consequences of a sovereign not having control of the money supply, some negative, and so it also depends on your political ideology, right? But ultimately it's about, okay, what are you replacing it with? Because if you're replacing it with a money that is going to be controlled by another political entity, so if you're replacing your local money with the US dollar, now you're putting yourself at the mercy of the U.S. central bank's monetary policy, and so that has caused issues in other countries as well. Now, if you're giving it to a kind of a supranational entity like the ECB, well, then it gets into, do we want a sound money like Germany wants, or do we want an easy money like Greece or Italy want? Because they're trying to have a government that is bigger in the sense of has bigger deficits, has more debt, and thus needs more inflation in order to avoid that becoming big of a problem. But ultimately, I think that the reason that debt and deficits are something government and politicians like is that it helps them be unaccountable. It allows them to buy votes without having to put up the cost of buying those votes, which is to increase taxes. And so inflation causes governments to be unaccountable. And if they were under the Bitcoin standard, where they cannot change the monetary policy and where they don't have sovereignty, then it would cause governments to be more accountable to citizens and voters. And I think that that's not a good thing for people who want big government, because ultimately big government only works if it's inefficient. If big government is efficient, it actually kind of destroys its own use case.
Yep.
So if you had an efficient government that is efficiently solving poverty, then poverty becomes solved, and then you don't need a government program for it anymore, and they shut it down. So it's a very small government, right? And so the same thing with the war on drugs. Like, if the government was very efficient, then they would efficiently get rid of drugs in the country, and then you wouldn't really need huge militarized police arresting people and putting lots of people into prison. So I do think that having a smaller government is good, even if you want public policy outcomes that people would describe as being on the left, of we want to redistribute wealth. You could very efficiently redistribute wealth. You don't need to hire a huge public sector of bureaucrats to redistribute wealth. You only need a very small number of people to do that with. So ultimately, I think that that's something that we have to look forward to when Bitcoin takes over.